The gate was open. No one shouted. No one pushed them forward. No one stood behind them with a weapon or a command. The choice was theirs, clear and undeniable, yet something unseen held them in place. Some stepped closer to the exit, others looked away, and most did nothing at all. Freedom was no longer a reward or a promise. It was simply there, waiting, and that made it heavier than any order they had followed before. Freedom did not arrive with ceremony inside the camp. There were no announcements, no flags raised, and no sudden change in the daily routine that had shaped life there for months. The gates were opened quietly, as if they had always been meant to stand that way, and the guards did not call attention to the change. For the Japanese prisoners of war, this absence of spectacle made the moment harder to understand. Freedom, when it came, did not look like liberation. It looked like another ordinary day. Most of the men noticed the change only gradually. At first, it was a rumor carried from one barracks to another, spoken in low voices and without certainty. Someone had walked closer to the perimeter than usual and had not been stopped. Another man had stood near the gate longer than regulations once allowed, and nothing happened. No whistle sounded, no command followed. The camp did not react. That silence was more unsettling than any shouted order could have been. For men who had lived under rigid structure for so long, choice had become unfamiliar. Every movement, every hour, every task had once been decided in advance, not only by guards, but by routine itself. Meals arrived at the same time. Roll calls followed predictable patterns. Even rest felt scheduled. In such an environment, the idea of deciding for oneself did not feel natural. It felt exposed, almost dangerous, as if making the wrong choice might invite consequences that were no longer clearly defined. Some prisoners approached the open space near the fence and stopped there, not crossing any line, not testing what lay beyond. They looked outward, but their bodies remained angled inward toward the camp. Others avoided the area entirely, choosing instead to remain within the familiar geometry of barracks and paths. The camp had shaped not only their days, but their sense of safety. Inside it, life was limited, but it was predictable. Outside it, nothing was certain. The American guards observed without interference. This was intentional. The absence of force was not a mistake or an oversight. It was part of a broader policy that allowed prisoners to make decisions without immediate pressure. No one was ordered to leave. No one was ordered to stay. The expectation was simple. The men would decide for themselves. What followed, however, revealed how deeply captivity had altered the meaning of freedom. For many prisoners, leaving the camp raised questions they were unprepared to answer. Where would they go? How far could they walk? What would happen if they returned? The rules had not been explained in detail, and this lack of clarity created hesitation. In a system where every action had once been governed by instruction, the absence of instruction felt like a trap. Freedom without guidance did not feel like permission. It felt like risk. There was also the weight of responsibility. Inside the camp, responsibility had been minimal. Decisions were made elsewhere. Failure was collective. Outside the camp, even a small step carried personal consequence. To walk away was to accept uncertainty alone. For men shaped by years of hierarchy and shared obligation, this kind of individual choice felt unnatural. It was easier to remain where responsibility was diluted by routine. As the days passed, it became clear that most prisoners would not leave, even though nothing prevented them from doing so. The open gate remained open. The guards remained indifferent. Life continued inside the camp with only minor adjustments, as if freedom had been quietly placed on the ground and ignored. What the camp revealed in that moment was not weakness or fear alone, but something more complex. The structure of captivity had not only confined the prisoners physically, It had reshaped how they understood choice itself. Freedom, when offered without force, demanded something unfamiliar. It required initiative, trust, and the willingness to act without instruction. For many Japanese POWs, those qualities have been slowly eroded by months of ordered living. The camp no longer needed walls to hold them. Habit was enough. And so, even as the gate stood open, most remained exactly where they were, uncertain not of what freedom meant, but of how to live with it. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. Once it became clear that no one would force a decision, the camp settled into an uneasy stillness. The gates remained open, yet nothing moved toward them. Days passed, and the absence of change became its own form of routine. Freedom was no longer a moment. It became background noise, something present but unaddressed, like a question left deliberately unanswered. Inside the barracks, conversations shifted in subtle ways. The men spoke less about escape and more about uncertainty. Without clear boundaries, they found it difficult to measure their actions. In captivity, limits had defined safety. Outside those limits, there was no clear reference point. To walk beyond the camp was not an act of rebellion anymore. It was an act without definition. Many prisoners began to realize that freedom demanded more than permission. It demanded direction. For years, purpose had been assigned to them, whether through military hierarchy or camp routine. Even captivity had offered structure. Wake, eat, work, rest. Each day mirrored the one before it. Now, with choice introduced, but no guidance provided, time began to feel shapeless. Hours stretched without meaning, and days lost their edges. The psychological weight of this change was not immediate, but it was persistent. Some men stood near the open spaces each morning, as if considering departure, only to return to their bunks by afternoon. The decision was never completed. It lingered, unresolved, carried forward into the next day. This pattern repeated until indecision itself became habitual. For others, freedom stirred discomfort rather than relief. Leaving the camp meant stepping into a world that had continued without them. The war had moved forward. Cities had changed. Families might no longer exist as they were remembered. Inside the camp, time felt suspended. Outside it, time had not waited, remaining where they were offered a strange sense of protection from that reality. The guards noticed these patterns but did not intervene. Their role was no longer to command, but to observe. From their perspective, the absence of escape attempts was unexpected. The assumption had been that freedom would naturally be taken once offered. What they saw instead was hesitation shaped by long-term control. The men were not restrained by fear of punishment. They were restrained by the absence of instruction. Gradually, small adaptations emerged. Prisoners began to redefine the camp as something closer to a village than a prison. Tasks were redistributed informally. Men chose roles for themselves, often mirroring the structures they had known before capture. Order reappeared, not because it was enforced, but because it was familiar. Freedom was reshaped into something manageable by recreating structure within it. This transformation revealed a deeper truth. Freedom, when introduced abruptly after prolonged confinement, could feel overwhelming rather than empowering. Choice without context felt like abandonment. The camp had once stripped the prisoners of autonomy. Now, autonomy returned without explanation, and many found themselves unprepared to receive it. As days turned into weeks, the open gates became symbolic rather than practical. They represented possibility, but not direction. Most men remained inside, not because they were forbidden to leave, but because leaving required a kind of internal shift that had not yet occurred. Freedom had been granted externally, but internally it remained incomplete. What the camp demonstrated in this phase was not passive obedience, but psychological inertia. The habits of captivity had settled too deeply to be undone by a simple change in rules. Before freedom could be used, it first had to be understood. An understanding, for men shaped by years of imposed order, did not come quickly. As freedom remained and used, something quieter began to surface inside the camp. The issue was no longer whether the men could leave, but what leaving would require of them internally. Choice, once imagined as relief, started to feel heavy. It demanded clarity, responsibility, and a willingness to accept consequences alone. For men conditioned by years of collective structure, this weight felt unfamiliar and exhausting. Inside captivity, decisions had been shared or removed entirely. Responsibility had been diluted by hierarchy, routine, and shared fate. If something went wrong, it belonged to the system, not to the individual. Freedom reversed this logic. A single step beyond the camp would belong entirely to the man who took it. Success or failure would no longer be absorbed by the group. This shift made choice feel less like opportunity and more like exposure. Some prisoners began to recognize this discomfort without being able to name it. They felt uneasy not because they feared punishment, but because they feared error. What if leaving was the wrong decision? What if it led nowhere? What if returning was no longer allowed? The lack of clear answers turned freedom into a test rather than a gift, and few felt prepared to take it. The passage of time intensified this effect. Each day the gate remained open without action. The idea of leaving grew heavier. What might have felt possible at first began to feel overdue. The longer no one left, the more noticeable departure would become. To be the first meant standing apart, drawing attention, and breaking the unspoken agreement of stillness that had settled over the camp. This social pressure was subtle but powerful. No one forbade departure, yet everyone noticed who approached the gate. A man lingering near the exit became an object of quiet observation. Not judgment, but awareness. In a place where anonymity had provided safety, visibility felt risky. Remaining within the group offered protection, even if that protection was psychological rather than physical. Internally, the men also struggled with identity. For years, they had been prisoners defined by restriction. Freedom threatened that identity without offering a replacement. Outside the camp, they would be something undefined, neither soldiers nor civilians, neither prisoners nor free men in any familiar sense. Staying allowed them to remain within a known role, limited but stable. Some attempted to imagine life beyond the camp, but the images felt distant and incomplete. Memory could not fill the gaps. The world outside had continued to change, and the men sensed that they would step into something unfamiliar. Inside the camp, life was narrow but predictable. Outside it, life was wide and uncertain. Faced with that contrast, many chose the certainty they knew. Over time, the idea of leaving lost emotional intensity. It stopped feeling urgent and became abstract. The open gate no longer symbolized immediate possibility. It became part of the scenery, acknowledged but not engaged with. Freedom, once a question, faded into background presence, demanding nothing and offering nothing concrete in return. What emerged in this phase was not resistance to freedom, but fatigue with decision-making. Choice required mental energy that had been gradually worn down by captivity. The men had adapted to environments where thinking ahead was unnecessary. Now, freedom demanded foresight, planning, and initiative, qualities that had gone unused for too long. By the end of this stage, remaining inside the camp was no longer a temporary hesitation. It was a settled position. The men had not rejected freedom explicitly. They had simply learned to live without acting on it. Choice had become a burden rather than a relief, and avoiding it felt like the most manageable path forward. The camp, unchanged in structure, now held men who were free in theory but bound by habit and hesitation. Freedom existed at the edge of their days, visible but heavy, waiting for an internal readiness that had not yet returned. And until that readiness emerged, the open gate remained unused, not because it was closed, but because crossing it required more than permission. As hesitation turned into habit, the camp began to settle into a new equilibrium. The open gates remained, but they no longer drew attention. What had once felt unusual slowly became ordinary. The men did not discuss leaving anymore, not because the option was forbidden, but because it no longer felt relevant to daily life. Staying had quietly become the normal choice. Routine reasserted itself in subtle forms. Men woke at familiar hours, gathered in familiar places, and followed patterns that no longer needed enforcement. These routines were not imposed by guards. They were maintained by comfort and predictability. Inside the camp, life still had edges. Outside it, life remained undefined. Normalcy, even a limited one, carried a powerful pull. This shift affected how freedom itself was perceived. Instead of being something to act upon, it became something abstract, almost symbolic. The open gate stood as proof that captivity had technically ended, yet it did not demand response. Freedom no longer felt like an invitation. It felt like a condition that existed somewhere beyond immediate concern, detached from the rhythm of everyday survival. Social dynamics reinforced this transformation. When most men remained inside, staying no longer felt like hesitation. It felt like alignment. To leave would have meant separating not only from the camp, but from the shared experience that had sustained them. Community had formed through confinement, and walking away from it felt like another kind of loss. The few who continued to approach the perimeter did so less frequently. Their movements slowed, their pauses shortened. Eventually, even these gestures faded. Without momentum, possibility dissolved. Freedom that is not used does not remain urgent. It becomes theoretical, and theory has little power over habit. Internally, the men noticed that anxiety associated with choice had diminished. Not because answers had appeared, but because the questions had been set aside. Decision-making requires engagement, and disengagement had become a coping mechanism. By narrowing focus to what was immediately manageable, the men reduced psychological strain. Staying required no explanation. Leaving required many. The guards observed the camp with quiet curiosity. The absence of escape attempts contradicted expectations, but it did not disrupt operations. From an administrative perspective, the situation was stable. Order remained intact. The lack of movement was interpreted as preference rather than paralysis. No effort was made to encourage departure, because departure was no longer seen as necessary. Over time, even the language surrounding freedom began to fade. The men stopped referring to themselves as prisoners, but they did not adopt the language of free men either. They existed in a space between definitions, no longer confined by force, yet not moving beyond confinement by choice. This ambiguity became easier to live within the clarity that freedom demanded. By this stage, remaining inside the camp no longer felt temporary. It felt appropriate. The boundaries that once represented restriction now represented familiarity. Crossing them would have meant abandoning a structure that still functioned, however limited it was. Staying preserved continuity, and continuity felt safer than uncertainty. What emerged was not loyalty to the camp, but attachment to predictability. Freedom, stripped of direction and support, offered none. The men did not stay because they believed they belonged there. They stayed because leaving required a break with everything that had kept them stable, through captivity. In this phase, freedom had lost its urgency entirely. It no longer waited at the gate. It receded into the background of life, acknowledged but untouched. The men continued to live as they had before, not because they were compelled to, but because staying had become the easiest way to move forward without confronting the weight of choice. By the time staying had become normal, freedom itself had begun to change shape. It was no longer something the men weighed or considered. It no longer created tension or hesitation. It simply existed as a distant concept, detached from daily experience. The open gate remained, but it no longer represented a decision waiting to be made. It had become part of the environment, noticed only in passing. The men adapted to this condition with quiet efficiency. Life inside the camp continued to provide structure, rhythm, and predictability. These elements had once been imposed. Now they were maintained voluntarily, not because they were ideal, but because they were familiar. Familiarity carried comfort, even when it limited possibility. The mind preferred what it could anticipate over what it could not define. This adaptation altered how the men understood themselves. They no longer thought in terms of being restrained or released. Those categories required comparison, and comparison required engagement with alternatives. Instead, they focused on maintaining balance within the present. Days were measured by routine rather than by progress. Success meant stability, not movement. Freedom, in this context, began to feel strangely irrelevant. It offered no clear advantage over the life that had already formed inside the camp. Outside lay uncertainty, responsibility, and the need to rebuild identity from nothing. Inside lay continuity. The men were no longer waiting to be free. They were living within a system that no longer demanded anticipation. Memory played a role in this shift. Over time, the initial shock of realizing the gates were open faded. The moment lost emotional clarity. What remained was the present arrangement, reinforced day after day. Without action, to keep the idea of freedom alive, it slowly lost significance. Possibility, when used, does not remain vivid. It dissolves into abstraction. The emotional landscape reflected this dissolution. There was no sense of defeat or resignation. Instead, there was calm neutrality. The men did not mourn freedom because mourning requires attachment. Attachment had weakened. Freedom was no longer something they felt deprived of. It was simply something they did not need in order to continue. Social life inside the camp stabilized further. Relationships were defined by shared routine rather than shared longing. There was little talk of the outside world, not because it was forbidden, but because it felt distant and irrelevant. Conversation centered on what could be managed, not what could be imagined. The present absorbed attention completely. The guards continued to observe without interference. From their perspective, the situation appeared resolved. The absence of escape attempts suggested contentment or acceptance. What remained unseen was that the meaning of freedom itself had shifted. It was no longer resisted or feared. It had been quietly set aside. By this stage, the camp no longer functioned as a prison in the psychological sense. It functioned as an environment the men had learned to inhabit without strain. The absence of force mattered less than the presence of routine. Freedom had been granted, but it had arrived without context, support, or direction. Without those elements, it could not compete with habit. In the end, the most profound change was not that the men refused freedom, but that freedom stopped asking anything of them. It no longer demanded courage, decision, or movement. It existed at the edges of their lives, acknowledged but unused. And in that quiet withdrawal, freedom lost its power, not because it was denied, but because it no longer felt necessary for survival. In the end, the most striking detail was not that freedom had been offered, but that it required something the men no longer had. It required initiative, direction, and the willingness to step into uncertainty alone. Captivity had not only limited movement, it had reshaped how movement itself was understood. The open gate never closed. It did not need to. Habit proved stronger than barriers, and routine proved more persuasive than force. Life continued inside the camp, not because the men were compelled to remain, but because staying demanded less from them than leaving. This was not a story about fear or weakness. It was a story about adaptation. When choice disappears for long enough, it does not return easily. Freedom, when introduced without preparation, can feel abstract, distant, and heavy. It asks questions before it offers relief. The men carried on, day after day, within a structure that no longer needed to confine them physically. The camp remained, but its walls mattered less than the habits formed inside them. Freedom existed beyond those walls, unchanged and available, yet unused. And so the story ends quietly, without escape or resolution, not because freedom failed, but because it arrived too late to feel familiar. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.